Okay, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this evening for our Dry Off webinar 2021 with Munster Bovine. And the title for this evening's webinar is Big Challenges Require Smart and, most importantly, Practical Solutions. My name is Tommy Heffernan. I'm a vet and I'm going to be chairing the discussion this evening. And I'm really delighted to be joined by what is an expert panel in the field of milk quality. I'm going to be joined by Catherine McAloon, veterinary herd health specialist, lecturer in UCD. I'm going to be joined by Don Crowley, milk quality specialist with Teagasc, Dennis Howard, technical vet with Munster Bovine. And I'm going to be joined also at the end by Munster Bovine CEO Doreen Corridan, who's going to summarize, I suppose, our key findings and discussions tonight. So I suppose we're talking about milk quality. It's an area I'm particularly interested in myself, and it's a really important time of year when we talk about milk quality. We're talking about the dry period in the cow. We're looking at treating existing infections, particularly preventing new infections, and it sets us up for the next lactation season. It's a rest for the udder, it's a rest for the cow, the machine, and most importantly, maybe the farmer as well. So I'm going to I suppose we're going to start off with a couple of short presentations. So we're going to start off with Catherine McAloon, who's going to give us maybe a helicopter overview around drying off the cow. And then we're going to go to Don Crowley, who's going to give us some practical tips around the drying off process. And then the final presentation, Dennis is going to look at FarmOps, smart solutions. How does the dry off module in FarmOps help around drying off and selective trichotherapy? Then after our presentations, we're going to go to a panel discussion. So I'd really ask people, this is a huge opportunity to submit your questions and get as much as we can out of what really is an expert panel. The objective tonight is really focused on practical solutions. If we encounter any technical difficulties, as myself and Don were discussing beforehand, Zoom is the gift that keeps on giving, bear with us, but we shouldn't have an issue. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Catherine McAloon, a dairy herd health specialist and bovine specialist with the European specialist bovine medicine and lecturer in UCD. And if you ever have a problem or a technical query that's a big one, Catherine's the person to ring. So Catherine, your microphone is off, I see. So you're ready to go. So over to you, Catherine, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks a million, Tommy, and thanks a million to everyone for being here and the invitation. I do like to talk about mastitis. So I guess briefly, I'm going to just introduce the concept here before I get into the nitty gritty around selective trico. And I guess antimicrobial resistance is a term that, you know, pretty much everyone is familiar with. But at the same time, I thought it was important just to kind of go through a very quick 1 or 2 slides in terms of the concept of why selective trico is upon us. And ultimately, the use of antibiotics, anytime we use an antibiotic in human or animal medicine, there is a possibility that we contribute to the health risk of both humans and animals by creating reservoirs of resistant bacteria or their residues. So we can create a situation where bacteria have developed resistance genes. That can be zoonotic bacteria that pass between humans and animals, or it can actually be commensal bacteria even in the gut of humans or animals. So every time we use that antibiotic, again, even in human medicine, we give the bacteria, we hope that the antibiotic kills all of the bacteria, but often they don't. And those bacteria that still survive have many complicated mechanisms by which they can develop resistance. And those that do survive in the presence of that antibiotic compound then have a selective advantage, or they have resistance or the ability then to multiply and become a new population, where those bacteria then are actually much more resistant to the antibiotics that we once would have used to treat them. And that's particularly important for pathogens. I guess this is a very complicated slide, but ultimately it's trying to just highlight that everything in terms of, we hear a lot about One Health, but really animals, humans, and the environment that we share are very closely interconnected. And I'm not going to start to try and describe each of these links, because I would be here all night and I don't understand half of them myself. But I suppose the reality is that in terms of AMR, we're not talking about direct links necessarily. We're not always talking about direct links between humans and animals. Of course, that exists, but there's also much more complex risky relationships and interactions in terms of where those bacteria that have resistance genes can hang out, like waterways, soil, and so on. And it's a very complicated relationship and makes the threat of AMR all the more difficult to deal with and to understand. This graph is really just to kind of highlight that really since we started using antibiotics, the more we use, the greater we increase the speed at which antimicrobial resistance appears. That can be seen across multiple sectors and seen globally. And it's probably the overriding principle of where the regulation, which brings us to the discussion tonight, arose from, that the more antibiotics we use, the greater or the more antimicrobial resistance that we see. And I suppose it's important to highlight that I'm not talking about, or at least not right now, a direct causal link. So we're not saying that you go out and use dry cow antibiotics in a cow that, tomorrow she has antimicrobial resistant bacteria in her udder or milk. Of course, that could be the case, and the potential is there. But I suppose the holistic picture and where this legislation came from is more at global level, where across all sectors, both human and agriculture, any increase or use of antibiotics have been targeted to try and improve our use, to be more prudent in order to reduce that speed at which AMR is developing, because ultimately we don't have new antibiotics coming on stream and they are a finite resource. So although this headline from a couple of years ago was sensationalist at the time, I think it's probably, given the 18 months that we've lived through right now, public health, pandemics, all the rest of it have become sort of terminology that are part of everyday language now. And although it may seem far away, the predictions, this modelling was presented as part of a report done for the UK government, where they looked at predicting deaths by antimicrobial resistant infections. By 2050, they predicted that 10 million people would die every year due to the impact of AMR and not being able to treat infection, and that more people would be dying from this than would be of cancer by 2050. And although that was certainly sort of headline news and high impact at the time, the reality, I suppose, is that this isn't a future threat. This is sort of lives among us right now in terms of, the ultimate, we are very fortunate that we live in a country with very little human TB, but human TB is still one of the leading causes of infectious diseases that kills humans worldwide. And although for many years we had drugs that were very successful at treating human TB, those drugs are really no longer working as they should, and it's become a real challenge. I guess in terms of the big threats that loom in terms of AMR are probably more in the sphere of chemo patients, immune compromised patients, where antibiotics are needed as part of the mainstay of treatment. But certainly we are dealing with, at least in the veterinary hospital scenarios, maybe small animal and human medicine as well, where we see multi-drug resistant pathogens have emerged and are becoming, a daily threat now. They are current and among us and not necessarily a future phenomenon. So I guess that was just a whistle-stop tour of the backdrop to where this regulation came from. So Regulation 2019/6 was agreed by the EU in 2019 after about 4 years of negotiation. And it came as a direct response to the OIE that asked for a global response to antimicrobial usage in agriculture. And really the overriding aim of this legislation is to reduce antibiotic use in food producing animals, but with a particular focus on preventative use. It had other aims, such as harmonizing drug use and sales and so on across Europe. And ultimately, as this regulation is due to come into force in January 2022, we still await the much awaited document from the Department of Agriculture that tells us how exactly that legislation will be enacted in Ireland. I suppose it is somewhat, there's certainly prescribers are waiting on that SI with great eagerness, but ultimately the mandate for what we need to do as an industry is quite clear within that document from the EU in terms of reducing preventative use. And I suppose, in terms of what we're here to talk about tonight, targeting things like blanket dry cow therapy. So the legislation actually goes as far as to state that antibiotics cannot be specifically used to compensate for poor hygiene, inadequate husbandry, poor farm management, and so on. And it's quite explicit on some of that. So to introduce then, I guess, why, I suppose it's to state the obvious, but I guess to think about why we're using dry cow treatment. And if we think, there are largely two reasons. One is to treat existing mastitis infections, which we should always be able to do. However, The second reason, and we often also use dry cow antibiotic to prevent infections across the dry period. And I suppose for many years as vets, and certainly I qualified with that mantra, that part of the 5-point plan was that we should use blanket dry cow therapy to control contagious mastitis, and it's been very successful. But despite it having said years of that, we're now actually saying, well, hold on a minute, we probably shouldn't be doing that anymore. So it is quite a sea change that we're saying actually blanket dry cow needs to be moved away from, and this needs to be more targeted. So quite a difficult change. And in terms of the regulation, I guess what I'm talking about in terms of how that affects our approach to dry cow therapy, well, of course, we'll still be able to treat existing mastitis infections, but where the legislation becomes enforced is that we really need to provide evidence of infection, as well as possibly also revising our choices of antibiotics. So there are some antibiotics, so not necessarily CIAs or critically important antibiotics, but they're actually a step above that, known as the highest priority critically important antibiotics. And they're the ones that are really need to be kept for use if any of us ended up in hospital for human medicine. And they're the ones that there should be, that part of this regulation will enforce strict curtailment of. So we do use those drugs in both treatment of in-lactation mastitis and also as dry cow tubes. So there may be some revision in the choice. That shouldn't be too onerous because largely we don't need those drugs anyway. So treating mastitis is still going to be largely on the table, with maybe a slight revision of our drug choices. However, it's the treating uninfected cows to prevent mastitis across the dry period where this regulation really is set up to target. So it's saying that we should really not be given antibiotic unless there is evidence of infection. And, you know, ultimately use of teat sealant and good dry period management will hopefully deal with the rest. So I'm certainly not going to go into too much around sustainability tonight. If you look at social media these days, it's a bit depressing, certainly all the stuff that's going on in regard to climate. But ultimately, it's hard to escape the fact that AMR and animal health is certainly a part of that pillar of sustainability. And there has been up to now lots of social drivers for reducing antimicrobial usage. And I suppose ultimately this legislation is the final catalyst by which we are having to address that. There's lots of scientific research that shows selective trichotherapy when done correctly is very successful and in fact has many advantages, but the key operative words there, I suppose, being done correctly. And ultimately, you know, we're going to hear about them tonight, I'm sure, and I'm sure everyone in the audience is well aware there's going to be some significant challenges to delivering this legislation. So, you know, we do have a seasonal calving system in Ireland, which brings, you know, its own pressures in terms of large numbers to be dried off around the same time. But I suppose more importantly, lots of animals being dry in the accommodation at the same time and to be calved down through, you know, the same calving pens at a pinch point in the time of year when it's extremely busy. So seasonality, maybe not having all herds milk recording, moving from this sea change from what we, you know, largely as an industry mostly practice blanket dry cow therapy to the use of teat sealant only. They are significant challenges, and I suppose there's nobody here going to shy away from them and suggest that it's not going to be difficult. But ultimately, as part of this regulation, it is certainly going to be a necessity. So I know that there's a lot of sort of over-regulation possibly at the moment, and with all the climate stuff going on in particular, it's a very difficult and challenging time. But the one thing I would say about this regulation, and it's actually somewhat sad, it's at least my opinion anyway, maybe others will disagree, is that we have to have legislation to drive this change. Because if we look at countries like New Zealand, you know, they're operating on about 50% of herds with selective trichotherapy purely on, you know, social responsibility, not with any legislative drivers. So this, I suppose, yes, it is regulation. Yes, it's going to be difficult, and yes, it's a big change. But I guess ultimately, you know, this is a sort of a no-brainer in terms of, you know, we really do need to think about why we're using antibiotics, and I guess to try and frame it positively, at least the motivations and the reasons for this regulation are positive and not necessarily big bad Brussels with another law for us to follow and adhere to. So there is a list of the drugs, those HPCIAs that we're supposed to be avoiding in the AHI document, which is available online if you're interested in looking at those and what we shouldn't be using. So that's really all I have to say on the backdrop. I guess it probably goes without saying, but to move on to, I suppose now, the actual how we get on with it. And I would ask two questions, I suppose. One, does my herd have good control of mastitis? And two, can we calve down uninfected cows? So in terms of good control of mastitis, that's something I'll come back to time and time again, because ultimately the fundamental principle for selective trichotherapy is good control of mastitis, which means we don't need to rely on antibiotics so much. So we talk about, bulk tanks consistently below 200,000 as a metric for good control of mastitis, a low recent infection rate as a control of spread, low persistent infection rate, so we don't have lots of chronically infected cows hanging around. We need to have data. We also need to have clinical case records. So, there are targets for that, but there are also, in terms of records, is probably one of the biggest things that we must have. And the final thing then is around the dry period performance. So certainly from milk recording that's done early enough in lactation, we can tell a lot from our dry period performance. Did we actually manage to get across the dry period without creating lots of new infections? And did we have good cure rates? So not going to go too much into data, but just to reflect on the cell check report, which some of you will be used to seeing, in terms of, we look at herd prevalence here, the percentage of the herd that's over 200, or the percentage of cows that is infected. And ultimately that's directly related to the bulk tank average. And certainly we can manipulate that. If there's, a couple of cows at 9 million, then that's going to be somewhat skewed. But prevalence of infection is one thing. The bottom half of the first page, this recent infection rate, is a measure of spread. Persistent infection, this is our chronic cows, probably source of lots of mastitis in Ireland. And on the second page of our cell check report, and is really important information in terms of dry period performance. I guess where this really falls down is that, we only have about 30% of milk recording herds actually recording in the first 30 days, and probably only about 60% have actually recorded by about 60 days in milk. So we lose a lot of information by delaying the first recording, because ultimately to make it into this calculation, cows need to be recorded, early enough in lactation. So those are probably the first places I would start, and in terms of asking those questions. If it's not a unanimous yes to both, then I guess the first port of call is to really try and focus on mastitis control, whether it's marginal gains or larger gains that need to be had in order to get the herd to a place where we can more safely practice selective Trico and ultimately reduce that requirement of antibiotics. And really that looks, if the answer is no, then it becomes about looking at trying to mastitis investigation and really trying to get a handle on the source of the mastitis. Is it coming from chronically infected cows, or is it coming from the environment? How is it being spread within the herd? And really trying to target and tackle those. Because ultimately, as I said there, and probably will say again a couple of times tonight, that the good mastitis control is fundamental for all of this to stand upon. So moving on then to the herds to actual practice of the selective trichotherapy, I think one thing just to quickly review, I suppose, is what is SCC. And when we talk about bulk tank SCC, or even individual cow SCC for the infection threshold, the 200,000 is a threshold value, not a target. Obviously herds that have a bulk tank of 190,000 probably have a few more infected cows than herds with a bulk tank of 110,000. But we're certainly saying that once we're below 200 consistently, there is, reasonably good control of mastitis, as opposed to once we're going over that, then we're saying that that's actually, not acceptable, and there's gains to be had there. So selective, of course, we can do it in any herd. We could go out this dry period and decide that I'm going to seal 50 cows. But at the same time, I think we probably all heard of the car crash herds and where things have gone wrong. And there's obviously very significant consequences if it's not practiced correctly. And I would also say that we should probably have a think about what we're trying to achieve. So we are trying to reduce antibiotics, but also to think about the concept that ultimately udders are not sterile. So, there is bugs in there. And when we use a dry cow tube, we probably obliterate a lot, both of good and bad bacteria. But if we don't use a dry cow antibiotic and we just seal the cow and we do it correctly, then it wouldn't be unusual. In fact, it's very common, and all international data would support that we do see transient increases in cell count for that reason that, it's not a sterile environment. So I'm talking about increases from 60,000 to 80,000, or 90 to 110, 110 to 120, nowhere near the realms of infection at 200 and crossing that threshold. But transient increases in cell count is a normal phenomenon. So I guess, but being very clear that it's not in the realms of infection. So I suppose our expectations of the selective process is probably something that we also need to address before embarking on it. So when we talk about selective, I guess we can refer to selective trichotherapy as selecting cows for antibiotic and teat sealant, or alternatively selecting cows for teat sealant only. It doesn't matter your whatever your definition is, but certainly when we talk about selecting cows for teat sealant only, we would suggest that they have certain criteria that deem them unlikely to be infected. But I would also point out there is, again, a huge plethora of international research that would back up the use of teat sealant. So in fact, in infected cows, that there is an additional advantage conferred by using a teat sealant in addition to a dry cow antibiotic. But also in uninfected cows, that teat sealant, once applied correctly, is usually very effective at preventing dry cow infections, of course, in the face of good dry period management. And I guess it goes without saying that in order to embark on any of this, then we really need to know at cow level now, not herd level, what's their infection status, which really can't be achieved successfully or repeatedly, or at least robustly, without milk recording data. So I guess I have two risks to talk about, and the two risks I think that probably are worth mentioning are, in terms of, as we move towards selective trichotherapy, hygiene at the point of dry off, and also our second risk, which is, are we, who are we treating? Are we missing a chance to treat an infected cow? So to talk first briefly about hygiene, I guess if we do nothing to a cow, infuse nothing into her teat, then obviously, we're not going to bring something in. Even if we do infuse an intramammary antibiotic as well as a teat sealer, we do run the risk of bringing in bacteria. But when we introduce a teat seal without an antibiotic, then there is a real possibility we've lost that safety blanket, and it's perfectly safe if it's done correctly. However, a speck of dirt on the end of the teat sealer, could have devastating consequences for that cow. Lost quarters, in fact, dead cows, very sick cows. So it's not something, I guess, the hygiene piece cannot be underestimated, really, is what I'm trying to say there, in terms of, and that all farm staff involved in the dry off protocol should be well aware that teat sealing is a very successful way of preventing dry period new infection, but only if it's done extremely hygienically. And it's a very important job, and I'm going to leave the detail to Don. But also, what comes into this piece as well is where the cow goes afterwards, stocking rate and so on, because that dry period management piece really has a large influence on what happens and the success or failure of the approach. And the second risk, I suppose, again, hard to fit it into one slide, but really, is there a missed opportunity? We use dry cow therapy to treat existing mastitis infections, and we don't want to miss that once in a lactation chance to treat an infected cow. So deciding on who needs treatment, of course, there's potential risk with that, and we don't want to miss an infected quarters. And I guess this really comes down to data, decent cow level data. And again, there is certainly an argument. There is research papers that say, oh, well, I only need to know what goes on in the last 3 months of lactation. I only need to know what goes on in the last month of lactation. And that's fair enough. But like everything, the more data we have, the more reliable it is. So, if we have information on a cow across her lactation, in September and November, as well as maybe just November, then we can be more confident in her infection status, and that whether she is uninfected or indeed whether she may have an infection and would benefit from that antibiotic tube. So the thresholds are pretty important, and I guess it's in terms of in herds with good control of mastitis, so our good bulk tanks running below 200 and so on, our cow level thresholds, we can be much more confident in saying, well, this cow is very unlikely to be infected, given that she's had 4 milk recordings below 100. You could drop that to 50, you could increase it to 120. And I'll touch on that in a second. But in herds with so bulk tanks running at 300, 400 and so on, then our confidence in our cow level thresholds becomes a little more difficult. So that pattern of SEC over time, both at herd and cow level, is important. Clinical mastitis is also important because, you can have, recurrent clinical cases and so on. And also, teeth lesions, things like that. If she had very chapped teeth and lots of lesions, then she probably isn't a candidate to do without antibiotic. And ultimately, it needs to be a criteria that you're happy with. There is cell check guidelines. They're no means a mandate. So there's certainly, obviously ability to change within that. But it's really difficult to avoid the necessity from regular milk recording. There is the opportunity for things like culture at dry off, an SCC taken close to dry off and so on. But in reality, none of those things would be as useful or as practical as SCC over time. But because ultimately we need to just sort of pick a definition for infected or uninfected and use that to decide on who gets treated and who doesn't. I'm not going to go into this, but this is a UK slide that some when they introduced selective first over there, where they basically changed the individual cow cutoff for sealer decisions based on the bulk tank. So in herds with low somatic cell count or with a consistently low bulk tank somatic cell count, they upped the individual cow threshold, versus in herds with maybe 250 bulk tank, they dropped their cutoff to 50,000 at individual cow level. This is an example from New Zealand. Again, I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but just to highlight that they changed their threshold based on whether there's presence of strep uterus in the herd or not, and Staph aureus or not, and so on. And ultimately, it's probably, we need to be careful extrapolating data from other countries with different pathogen profiles and so on. And we don't have Irish data to say, well, we can be confident in this or the other. So we have to go with what we can based on international experience, but also, common sense, I suppose. So in terms of herd level criteria, the suggested, and as I said, suggested current cell check guidelines, are that we would need a minimum of 4 milk recordings for each cow in the lactation, ideally 6. The bulk tank consistently below 200. Clinical mastitis data at least, and certainly not a major issue in the late lactation. A relatively low recent infection, that sort of shows reasonable control across the year. A recording close to dry off, and ultimately excellent standards of hygiene. And then within those herds, which are, then it becomes to cow level thresholds. And as I said, this is only a guideline, and there are lots of arguments for and against upping and reducing this. We are still going to overtreat cows. We're going to treat uninfected cows by using a threshold of 100,000. But starting from a place of blanket trichotherapy, it may help us build confidence. As if there's issues or any concern and we want to drop that threshold, that's okay too. But certainly the suggested threshold in well-controlled herds is potentially cows that have an SCC consistently below 100 would be a potential candidate for a sealer only and no evidence of infection, that have had no history of clinical mastitis and good teeth, skin and so on. But what's as important here, I suppose, is recording what cow got what, and also recording early enough in the next lactation. So, recording in the end of February, recording at the end of March, depending on calving pattern and so on, that we capture that data in, dry period performance, because once we kind of go over the 60 days in milk, we can't disentangle what was likely dry period or calving time in origin in terms of mastitis versus what could have happened in terms of lactation spread. So planning, I guess anybody who's involved in a cell check TASA will have been familiar with this, but if you go onto your ICBF and you are milk recording, you'll see your milk recording SCC profiles. And that allows you to, filter by highest to lowest, lowest to highest, and so on. And it helps us come up with a list, maybe a list of cows with evidence of infection, or alternatively, a list of cows that have no evidence of infection that we're going to go down the sealer only road in. I would say be confident in that list in terms of making a plan for who is getting what, and be clear on that before we embark on it. And I guess, plan and record the outcomes so that we can, see how things are going. And I'm not going to do any more on any more detail, because I know there are several speakers coming after me. And I guess just to conclude those key messages, really, ultimately we can't escape the need for good mastitis control to reduce that requirement for antibiotics. The purpose of Selective Trico is to reduce preventative use. And, there's really no argument really that can be one that will defend using antibiotics in uninfected animals. It certainly won't be easy. understanding cow selection criteria is important, particularly bespoke to your own herd. The attention to detail in the technique for dry off and dry period will be of paramount importance. Milk recording data is just that. It just is data unless we use it and turn it into very powerful information. There are lots of drivers for this, the social requirement, the sustainable requirement, but also now the legislative requirement. But certainly it can be done, and hopefully we can think about it positively, because the goal is certainly a noble one. Thank you, Tommy. Sorry if I went over time.
Absolutely excellent, Catherine. Fantastic presentation. Setting the scene, difficult times ahead. There is fears there. We'll get into it in the panel discussion, but a brilliant summary, I suppose, of the helicopter view of where we are and what we have got to do. Just to remind people, there's 2 fantastic questions in already. That in the questions and answers box at the bottom, put in your questions and we'll put it to the panel of expert speakers. So I'm going to move on, and our next speaker is Don Crowley. Doesn't need any introduction. Milk quality specialist with Teagasc. Incredibly practical, and I know he's got practical slides here as well around the process and challenge of actually drying off cows. So we can see your slides there, Don. You're good to go whenever you're ready. Your microphone is just off. There you go,
Thanks,
Don.
Thanks, Dad. Look, we'll have a bit of a chat. It's going through really, lads, I suppose, getting ready for the drying off. It's on us now. I suppose a couple of you have pulled first calvers here, starting to pull them out now, especially the way the weather's gone. But look, it's a huge high risk time. It's going to set us up for next year. And the consequences of getting it wrong, we see it every year on the calls next spring, and the consequences for next lactation are massive. And when you look at the cost base that we're looking at next year, we need all our ducks in a row. And like antibiotics and sealers they've wiped out tricho mastitis. You as farmers, you've seen this yourselves. How many times have you called the vet out to tricho mastitis? Basically wiped it out. But it's very poor technique. Like the crack that's going on at farm level, it's very, very poor. And if we think that's going to do at selective, you're going to destroy your herd of cows. And bad habits have really crept in, and then we see it every day when we go out. And this, I think, is a great example from the department. There was 3,500 samples sent into the department there, and a third of them were contaminated. That's just taking a sample. I might say it. So if that kind of technique is going to be used in administering sealer on its own to naive cows, you're going to destroy her the cows. And that's just, I think it's a great warning sign for us as farmers, just to see like what potential risk is in this. And like what kind of planning we're doing. We're going to need milk recording. Number one, that we are milk recording. For anyone out there that's not milk recording, get a milk recording now before you dry off, catch them through that report. It's going to be hard now, I suppose, because it's getting tight, but like you can't see how you did next spring unless you milk recorded this year, because that's what they're doing the comparison to. When Catherine said about doing it within 60 days, and Catherine highlighted the reports that we need to look for. So you're looking at a milk recording within 30 days, ideally drying off, and then your first milk recording within 60 days of the first cow calving next spring. So if you're going to start calving last week of January, you have to be penciling in a milk recording from Paddy's Day onwards. And like we look at the preparation, what needs to be done, the hygiene, the organisation, the help, the time, the consistency of routine across all the people. You have multiple people working in farms, and as Catherine highlighted, the management of drying off. And that report, like we take this farmer here, like with a new infection rate of 33%, he dried off 66 cows last autumn, and 22 out of the 66 calved down higher. Like if he's in trouble with an antibiotic and a sealer, he cannot contemplate selective then. And this is what's happening out at farm level. You have to look at these reports and you need to tackle, why is this wrong? My technique, my housing, and get your vet, your advisor in to go through these issues. Why are they happening? Because you're running out of time. And this is an autumn that we need to get our ducks in a row to get in for this for next season. Look, we've seen how cows have deteriorated from a cleanliness point of view in the last couple of weeks because of the dry matter in the grass. The intakes were exceptionally high and they were exceptionally loose. So noticing very dirty cows out there. So getting tails tipped at least 3-4 days before drying off, because you're giving a chance for it to dry up, the hocks to clean, get the beds clean. I'll be cleaning them twice a day at least. You can see that when you go into the houses, they have the bog man. I know they're expensive, but by God, they do some job in cubicles and cleanliness in houses. And you can see the same with scrapers and the robotic scrapers, how clean they can keep the whole housing. Nutrition has a big impact on this too, and what we do, long fiber and just trying to slow things down, trying to increase the dry matter of the dung. That plop plop effect rather than a shower coming down on top of you. And these are all things that we need to look at, just getting ready from the drying off. And look, 60% of all early lactation, and a lot of work is, and that work is coming from the dry period. So like you pay for the consequences next lactation. Like that's a huge significance. And like we look at sealers and a lot of farmers are saying, well, sure, look, with this kind of risk, why bother sealing them at all? Like this is why, because 50% of cows have open teats a week after, 23% are 6 weeks, and high yielding herds, half of them are open 6 weeks after drying off. So we really can't work without this internal teat sealer because it's protectives coming up to calving as well. So the leaky cows is very prone to mastitis, then, as we can see. So look, I suppose what we're looking at there is like the tail clippers and the scissors. I don't see enough automated, the battery held tail clippers that are being bought for 350. Fantastic investments, like especially with the wide heads. When it's handy, it will be done. Good, accurate culture and sensitivity, accurate because a lot of them are contaminated. So you need to really see what's inside the udder of the cow, not in the whole environment. The head torch, the glasses. A good few fellas have said that to me. Jesus, they never wear the glasses. But there's one thing just to make sure that the glasses and stuff, the cotton wool and the wipes made up beforehand, and the mets, trays for the cotton wool, the tweezers, the clipboards, all the little bits and pieces to get your ducks in a row. I think the cleaning and the disinfecting is a crucial point. When you're cleaning and disinfecting, you're cleaning from the front, and you teat seal then and tube from the back. And you often notice, any of you that have dried off cows, this is why you need help. If you're going tubing a cow, giving a dry cow and a sealer, and you take the teat, you've got to keep contact with the cow, because if you have to leave the cow and go over and get a seal and come back to her, she gets very agitated and she'll kick. So like when you catch that back right teat at number 1 and you administer your antibiotic, you keep contact with us, and somebody has got to hand you the sealer, or it has to be in a proximity that you can get at, because then she stays a lot more steady, content. It's a way different environment when you're trying to deal with it. I think this is one of the biggest things I see at farm level is, when you're cleaning and disinfecting, if you've got your cotton buds, when you've disinfected a teat and it's coming back brown, that's not disinfected. When you're disinfecting a teat, the cotton bud has to come back clean. Like the vets notice, the 4 vets that are here, that's surgically clean. Like you see the cotton buds when farmers or the wipes, they come back, oh, I cleaned that and I disinfected it. And it's when you see the brown contamination on it and the fecal matter on it, that's why we're running into trouble and with drying off cows, because fundamentally we have not disinfected that teat. And an awful lot of farmers are just doing no disinfection and just administering the tube because they're relying on the antibiotic that's killing any infection that we've administered through it. So look, the antibiotic, as you know, you're massaging that up into the quarter, making sure the teat sealer, I suppose, is the crucial point from the point of pinching the teat, pushing the sealer into it, and then I think it's good if you squeeze out a little bit of the sealer just out, and the teat is nice and plump. It's a bit of bismuth sulfate, and it pastes around the base of the teat, especially if there's a nice bit of hyperkeratosis on the end of the teat. That's one thing when you're drying off your cows, lads. Really take notice of the opening of the cow's teats. Is there any evidence of hyperkeratosis? Am I noticing a good degree of damage to the opening of the teat? You really have to look at it, your milking parlor setup, the vacuum settings, the ACR settings, the technique of milking. That's a crucial time when you're looking at your 100, 200, 300 cows. Like you should be seeing 5, 6, 7% hyperkeratosis in it, and the degree of it. Something just to bear in mind as you're drying off, because it's probably the one time where you give a real clinical look at the teats. Like, if you're finding that you have to squirt a bit of milk to find the opening of the teat, you're in a good place. So that's what you're trying to achieve when you're a sealer. But look, I suppose when we're looking at the considerations, the preparations, like the nutrition, I think that we're underestimating that in the sense of winding the cow down. The big herds have a big opportunity here, I suppose, in the sense that you can siphon out your 20, 30, 40, 50 cows, wind them down on a plane of nutrition, get the dungs nice and tight, bit of straw into the diet, the hygiene, getting the help organised, getting the necessary equipment all around, getting the phones ready and getting focused. I think the biggest thing we have to do is the number we're taking on in one go. That's the biggest impediment out there. And I think the only way around that is, if I'm drying off 60 cows, do it in bunches of 6. Drive in your 6, see after the 6, get them out, hose down the royals, and get the next 6 in. at least if there's an agitated cow or something there, she won't upset the whole bunch. Like having 20 or 30 in a row and trying to go through that, there's no way you can do it clean enough. You know, like I know people have to do that because they say, look, I have different houses, I have to dry them off to fit the house, or help is limited, I want to finish up. But at least in that scenario, I do them in bunches of 6, 4 to 6. I do my 6 out, clean down, change my gloves, double glove. I can get all my ducks in a row. Marking and recording, that's a big impediment. The lads that are selectively drying off, they're not putting in the cows that got selective only. So when I go looking at milk record next year, I haven't a clue which one, how they did. If you're doing selective, you record the cows that got selected. This sounds very basic, but it's just not happening at farm level. And then when you go looking to see how did I do, you can't analyze the situation. Like avoid wet days. There's no point doing it on a day that's fit for nothing else. It's not fit for drying off cows anyhow. You do them like I heard Doreen countless times saying when you're vaccinating cows, you avoid vaccinating your wet because it mitigates against lumps. And the same applies for drying off. You know, scraper timings. When I go into a house, I look at the clock and I see the timings and I look to see is it set at the 3, you know, is it at the 6, 8 hours a day? The leaking cow, you know, these free milking cows, I find it very good. You reseal them about 5 to 7 days later. No second antibiotic, but it does stop them from leaking. And definitely on the selective drying off, I think you really do need advice from your vet or from your advisor and going forward. And this is a year now where you get your ducks in a row to get ready for next year. A lot of you have probably tried this and you can up the bar and take it another little step, but proceed with caution. Rome wasn't built in a day. There's no panic. Just do it nice and steady. Build your business nice and easy. It's part of what it's going to be, and we'll see what the legislation is like. But there is big risks. But you can see then there's some fantastic ideas. I got this from Donald Lynch there up in Tip. Fantastic idea. Like there's his 6 tubes and his marking spray, his little canter wheels on the bottom of it, and his wipes. So you can see how fellas are thinking outside the box. Like it's a beautiful idea, like from the point of view of setting up and being ready for the hygiene setup and all this. But Tom, that was just like a whistle tap through to it. So I'll stop at that now, and we can have a little chat then afterwards.
Good man, Don. That was fantastically practical. Some great advice. I love that last slide there. The ingenuity that people have on farm is brilliant. It never fails to surprise. Wonderful presentation there with loads of practical tips. So looking forward to getting the questions going as well. Questions are coming in fairly rapidly here, so it's great to see. This webinar is recorded. If people, if it's going on a little bit longer than you expected, it is recorded. You maybe want to watch 9 o'clock news, but it's not great viewing these days for people in farming. So I'm going to really, I suppose, introduce our next speaker now. The last of the 3 speakers. The title for the webinar tonight was Smart Solutions. So Dennis Howard, technical vet with Munster Bovine, is going to go through the FarmOps module on drying off and how that can help make, I suppose, better decisions and help farmers make decisions around drying off. So over to you, Dennis. When you're ready you can share your screen.
Thank you, Tommy. I'm having actually trouble sharing it now at the moment. As luck would have it, shared it beforehand, no problem.
There you are. You're coming up there now.
There now, so. No,
there you are.
Very good.
Yeah. Just presenter mode and off you go. Super stuff.
It's like there now, we'll just wait for it to open up. So yeah, big challenges require smart solutions. I have to say, I think Don's 2 Keprevent buckets there took my fancy as regards a smart solution. So I'm going to talk about FarmOps. I suppose FarmOps is the Munster Bovine app, and it's I suppose the vision of FarmOps really is a herd management tool to help farmers every day. So whether it's recording serves, recording health events, treatments, and a lot of that is obviously going to feed into your compliance. And then all the data both coming from your own recording, and then the data coming from AI, from herd health, from the milk recording. And that is all available in your pocket. So you can pull out your phone and actually look at that data at any stage, whether it is in the cubicle shed or out the fields or whatever. And I suppose then the vision really from the start with the app was to try to bring in decision support. So actually to use that data to provide recommendations, so not just display it, but actually provide recommendations on a day-to-day basis to help farmers. And I suppose a great example of that in the app really is the dry off module. So that's an example of it there on the right, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, actually using the data to help herd owners on a day-to-day basis. So I suppose for those of you that are not familiar with the app, there's 10 modules inside it. So the breeding, fertility, feeds and sprays, weights, the herd health is in there. But I suppose when it comes to milk quality, the big ones are the milk recording, and that's looking at production, analysing production and looking at the SCC. And then the dry off, the one we'll be looking at tonight. So actually the creation of the dry off plan, how that can feed in and help you during the dry to have a successful dry period. So then I suppose the two big questions really the farmers need to know this time of year when it comes to drying off cows is when to dry them off and what treatment category they should be in. So whether they're getting a sealer and no antibiotic, whether it is a standard antibiotic, and then if they need a cure, that we do recommend that they get a long-acting preparation. So there's a lot of data that feeds into this, you know, from the AI serves, from the days in milk, the parity of the cow, so the first lactations are going to be treated differently. And then ideally the pregnancy scan data to actually confirm these serves and get accurate expected calving dates. And then of course the milk recording data, all the SCC over this lactation and the previous lactation, like Don and Catherine were talking about. And then ideally, we need to be recording our clinical cases. It's probably something we're not doing, but if you do record them in the app, they do feed into this analysis. So the app then, it actually takes all that data, takes all that information and creates a dry off plan for your farm. And that's an example there, so you can see the cows each week going along. The cows are selected that need to be dried off that week and the actual treatment category that they should be in. So then to look under the hood a little bit. So I suppose we categorize cows into 3 categories, depending on their SCC history and depending on when they're going to calve down. So the first category is normal cows. So these are cows that had a low SCC all year, no case of mastitis. So they're second plus lactation cows. So they're given 60 days dry, and if you're not doing selective trichotherapy, they're selected for a standard antibiotic and a sealer. So then the next category is what we refer to as problem cows. So these are cows that had high SCC throughout the year or a case of mastitis. So the parameters we use are if they had one or more SCCs over 500,000, 2 or more over 300,000, or 1 or more cases of mastitis. And these cows are given 80 days of a dry period, and then we do specify a long-acting dry cow preparation and a sealer to go along with that long dry period to try and maximize the cure in these cows. And we looked at the 2,000 herds that have FarmOps downloaded. So we just analyzed them to see how many second plus lactation cows were getting a long dry period, and it was 60% of the average herd. So some will be more, some will be less, but it was 16% of the herds. The average herd was getting a long dry period and a long acting tube. And then the next category is what we refer to as the vulnerable cows. So they're the first lactations. So we know that first lactations, they should get a longer dry period to give them a chance to recover from their first lactation. And then cows scanned and calf with twins. I mean, there's got to be other vulnerable cows that you need to take cognizance of yourself. So maybe a lame cows or cows with a low body condition, thin cows, but that's what goes into the app. So these cows then are given 90 days, and the treatment then is based on their SCC mastitis history. So across all the herds then it was 20% of the average herd. So that's generally the first lactation cows. And then there's the selective trico piece. So FarmOps will actually go through this as well, but I will go through it in a bit more detail. So this is a conversation that you can have with your veterinary advisor to actually go through this on FarmOps. And it will bring you through the herd criteria for the herd to check if the herd is suitable. How many cows are suitable then? And I'll go through those criteria as we go along. And then depending on the percentage you pick, it'll pick the most suitable percentage of those cows. So early calving and the lowest SCC and across all those cows. And I suppose then just a few other features that when you do dry off your cows in the app, those dry off dates are sent to ICBF, and this is critical really. So the dry off date, it ends the lactation for the cow, and that's critical for accurate milk recording reports. And then if you're calving, or if you're using the calving feature in FarmOps and register your calves, it'll also help you manage the withdrawals for the various treatments after calving. And obviously you're recording the remedies, so that's going to satisfy your compliance requirements. And then there's two, I suppose you can view your milking cows, and you can actually, that's an example of it there, you can scroll back and forth on the right there. So you can filter and sort and actually dry off any cow you want, or any bunch of cows you want. And you can view those cows, and then you can view the cows that you've already dried off as well. But then we'll have a quick run through the app, and then we'll finish up, Tommy, and we can go to the discussion. So when you open up at the moment, this is the tasks page. So there's going to be a dry off plan automatically created at the moment, and that's going to be displayed there on the tasks page. So you can go to the dry off plan there, or you can go into options at the bottom, and you'll see all the various modules. You can go into dry off, and that'll bring you into the dry off as well. So the first thing you'll see at the top is the herd status, which is nice to see. This farmer here is 95 cows. None of them are dried off yet, but as he dries off, that bar will fill up with orange there. So there's a nice visual of where how progress is going with regards to dry off. Then there's the tables there that I spoke about. You can actually record any individual cow here you want. And then this is you can actually get in to view the plan as well then here. So when you go into view the plan, you'll see each week down along what cows are going to be dried off and the treatment they're going to get. And at the very top, then you can adjust dry off plan settings. So we'll go in there, and there's a couple of things you can do in there to even personalize the dry off more. So the first thing to ask you is, are you going to shut down the parlour? So if you're not, it'll keep working away and give the cows those whatever dry period they need right along without stopping right into the next lactation. But if you do want to shut down the parlour before Christmas, take a break like Catherine was talking about earlier on, you can choose your date there, and it'll actually adjust the plan and dry off the cows before that date. Then the selective trichotherapy piece. So the question is, do you want to check if your herd is suitable for selective trichotherapy? So we do. And then it'll ask you these questions. So do you have 1 cubicle space per cow for the full dry period? So this is really about housing. And we know housing is so critical to try and prevent and have good hygiene and prevent new infections over the dry period. So this farmer said yes. So this is a real herd. Have you done a culture and sensitivity? So good, accurate culture sensitivity, like Don was talking about. Was it negative for strep agalactae? And no is the answer there. So there was no strep ag showed up in the culture and sensitivity. And we might talk about that afterwards, Tommy. And then has your bulk milk been below 200,000 for the year? It has. So there's 6 criteria here then. Some of them are the questions we've just answered, and more of them, the app will actually do the calculations. So the first thing it wants to know is there 4 milk recordings done in the last 12 months. So it knows that. Is there 80% of the cows milk recorded last year have been recorded soon after calving? So this is really just the dry period part of the cell check report. And both Don and Catherine, they referenced the numbers that the cows need to be recorded within 60 days of calving. And we're saying that 80% of them really should be recorded within 60 days of calving to get a good, accurate information here as regards the new infection rate. So this farmer, he had done that, and he had a low new infection rate. So it was less than 10% in the cows, less than 15% in the heifers. The next piece then is the questions that we answered already: the cubicle space per cow, the strep agalactae, and the low bulk milk over the year. So there's a tick alongside all these 6 criteria. So the herd is suitable, and this is a great opportunity if you're not doing the Teagasc dry cow consult, or maybe you've been doing selective with a few years, to maybe have a conversation with your vet and your advisor to go through this and see is the herd suitable. So do you want to proceed? So we're going to proceed, and then it'll do a calculation to see how many cows are suitable for selective trichotherapy. So in this herd, there's 42 out of the 95 suitable. So what are the criteria there? So the first thing is they must have 4 milk recordings in the lactation. The next thing is they must be recorded within 6 weeks of calving. They must have no case of clinical mastitis. Their last recording must be under 100,000. The average for the lactation must be under 100,000, and then no recording over 200,000 for the year. So they're the criteria we used. And with those criteria, there was 44% of the cows were suitable. So then the recommendation is there, if you're starting, not to dive straight in, to start off with 10%. There's a slider here in the bottom. It'll slide all the way up as far as the 44%, but this farmer is that this is what he's actually doing this year. He's going to do 18% of the cows. So then that the dry off plan is recalculated, and you can see now it's the same one as we were looking at earlier on, except there's some cows now that are going to get sealer only. So the first week there's a couple of cows overdue, and one of them is going to get sealer only. So then if we look at those cows and click in, you can see the 2 cows there are going to be separated that are getting an antibiotic and a sealer, and then the 1 cow that's getting a sealer only. So we'll just move on with her and record her dry off. So as you start recording the dry off, it brings you to the health events and treatments. So you're effectively applying a treatment. Now, the health event will be pre-selected to dry off. So we'll click on. We're going to search for our remedy, which is Boviseal in this case. So you can scan or start typing. Previous remedies like the dry cow tube there will be already there. You can pick them off. The remedy advice and the warnings then. So all what Don was talking about there, the cleanliness, the infusion of the sealer. If there's a warning there, it will be there. And then it is easy enough then, just use this protocol. There's no other protocol to use. Click on that, the name of the farmer, the prescribing vet, and finish. So when you have that done, then you have your compliance part sorted because the remedy is recorded. And then the cow is actually dried off, and that information is sent to ICBF, and that's going to end her lactation. And that was 1 cow, but if there's 6 cows there getting sealer only, or 10 cows, they can all be clicked together and dried off together. So it can be done quite quickly. So I suppose the takeaway messages then for the night, if you're using FarmOps, check out the dry off plan and have a look into it. You can have a look at the selective trichotherapy piece, see do you meet all those criteria, and like Don and Catherine were talking about, if you don't meet those criteria, why not? Have that conversation with your vet or your advisor. Why aren't I meeting it? And I suppose, like Don said, it's not a race, but the journey starts to try and get to meet all those criteria and get in a position where you can safely do selective trichotherapy next year. And then always record your dry off dates accurately. This is a big point for the milk recordings, so to get accuracy into those reports, and you can do it quite easily using the app. So that's me, Tommy.
Excellent, Dennis. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Always a good sign of a webinar where we have a huge crowd on tonight. Everyone stayed with us, and some fantastic questions are coming in. So I'm going to ask all the speakers to come back on, turn on their cameras, and we're going to have a chat. And I had lots of questions prepared to try and get some information out of all these experts myself. But I think the questions coming in are really, really good, and I'm going to go to them. So ambulance going on in the background here. Catherine, I'm going to go to you first. It's a really good question. And we talked about criteria. And could you define an infected cow? And I think this is, when we talk about an infected cow during the lactation, is it a cow that's an infection right now, or one that had one in April, for example? And is recording okay since that infection, or no recording showing high, but had a case or 2 of mastitis during the lactation? So I suppose define an infected cow. Would that be a fair question?
No, but
okay.
I'll certainly give it a go. I guess defining infection is a really interesting concept, because if you look at studies for mastitis, for example, they talk about culture and presence of a pathogen as the gold standard test, let's say. But there's actually quite a lot of argument now to say that, well, Staph aureus, for example, has intermittent shedding, doesn't be there all of the time. You mightn't culture it on one given day. If there's high SCC, there's obviously inflammation. Is that as an indirect measure of infection? You could do a CMT. There's lots of indirect and versus direct measures of, it's not only, but SCC is our sort of hybrid go-between that we accept as a reasonable proxy measure for infection status, let's say. But we could have a long argument about the merits of PCR, culture, and lots of other diagnostics. But ultimately, SCC is what we sort of is the internationally agreed metric for infection status in an individual cow level. Obviously, if she has presence of clinical mastitis at the time, then that's obviously infection. But then it becomes down to the threshold of that SCC. So it's certainly internationally agreed that 200,000 is the individual cow, that cow is infected, yes or no. And that's what, she makes it onto our problem cow list or not. if she's above 200,000. So I guess it comes, and then each country tend to look at this sort of differently. We don't have our own data that says, well, okay, we'd be confident to say that every cow with a cell count under 150,000 is uninfected, in a herd that's, with reasonable control of mastitis. So we sort of have to pick a hybrid. The current cell check guidelines, so in answer to the question, are that we've decided on 100. That's a guideline. It's not a mandate, so people can, alter that. As I mentioned, treating a cow in November with a dry cow tube, of course, there are 4 dry cow tubes to that cow who had 1 SCC of maybe 180 in July. Well, we're probably going to overtreat those cows. They probably, in all likelihood, may not be infected, but we have to start somewhere. And probably with the belt and braces approach, we're using that 100,000, to be confident that, or reason as confident as we can be, that we catch any cow with even a hint of infection. So the current cell check guidelines, in answer to the specific question, are that yes, if she had any case of clinical mastitis across the lactation, she should get an antibiotic. That probably is a kind of conservative and certainly a belt and braces approach. If you go to the UK, for example, lots of their herds will only look at the last 3 months of lactation. Did they have a clinical case in the last 3 months? If not, if it was back in March or April, then she's not necessarily deemed eligible for antibiotic treatment. So each country looks at it differently. I would say we've gone with the best we have, based on what data is available to us. We've said any strike above 100 deems her fit for antibiotic. We certainly you could up that threshold if you were very confident and say, well, actually, I'm going to up that to 150 at cow level and so on. But given where we're starting from, relatively more or less blanket dry cow therapy, I think the key point is that we start selective, we start slow and steady, build confidence with the sealer approach, and build confidence that those cows, and ultimately we have to do this. So whether we start with 10 or 20 or 50, we'll probably, well, all herds are hoping to be eligible or should be eligible within the next 12 months. So it's bespoke to the farm. It has to be what the farmer is confident in, and or the prescriber is part of that discussion. So I guess you could find lots of vets who would say, if she had a case in April and she's fine, she's had no clinical case since and her FCC is fine, well then no, she doesn't. We've gone with a bit of a belt and braces approach, and current cell check guidelines would say, yes, any case of clinical deems her fit for treatment.
Okay, so I think Don said it, Rome wasn't built in a day, and there's a lot of data feeding into all this information internationally. We've experts working here, and it's about reviewing that over time. And I think sometimes people fear as well that all the antibiotics are gone. They're not. This is a gradual process. This is why we're having webinars like this tonight, to have that practical information, to put maybe people's fears as well, to address those fears, So a difficult question to start off, Catherine, but you're well able for the difficult questions. Don, I'm going to go to you for a question there. You're on mute at the moment, just to let you know, but this is an interesting one. Again, back looking maybe at how we make decisions around the data. If a cow is a single case of mastitis very early on in the year and she's cured after her treatment and has an okay cell count for the rest of her milk recording during this year, should she still get a tube and seal it drying off? It's like that question, you've had half a glass of Guinness and can you have a pint of Guinness, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like Catherine said there, it's early on lactation, the highly likely is she will be fine. But at the present circumstance at the moment, and looking at the work that we've done in Moore Park and the trial with Kerry, you just don't take that you take your advice from your vet, but I would be very slow to take that kind of risk. It's just too early. And I think Phil is what I have to remember, just in an Irish context, we're a hybrid. We're indoor and outdoor. We're a cross between a New Zealand and indoor system in Europe with a very mild, humid weather type system. So we're a way riskier scenario than what we have in the continent or in New Zealand. And we have to take that cognizance of that and be careful and protect your business.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, we've damper weather. You mentioned the dry matter, the loose feces. It's a big challenge you don't see everywhere else. I'm going to stick with you on this question, Don, because you did mention it, and I think you answered it as well. And it's a very common question when it comes to drying off cows. Advice on how to prevent cows from leaking milk in cubicles. And in the days immediately after receiving dry cow therapy, if a cow leaks milk, does she have to be teat sealed again? Now they're after winning a football tournament here in the background, so I'm going to turn off my microphone.
Yeah, I think it's a very common question, you're dead right. And I think the nature of a lot of leaking is when they're on cubibles, the nature of the way the cow lies on the other and puts such pressure on the other, she'll drive out that sealer. So what I find anyway is resealing them 5 to 7 days afterwards, just being very careful of the hygiene. And what we generally would find, what farmers are doing, or what we would generally see is just reseal them if they've got an antibiotic and a sealer. If they were sealer only cows and they're leaking, most farmers will intervene with an antibiotic and a sealer at that stage then the second time. That's, I suppose it's just the fact that she's leaking. When we look back at some of the data coming back through the Moore Park ones, the brittle open type cows at sealer only are a risk. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, very good, Don.
John, those high yielding, very free cows, I mean, throw out a few bales of straw in the calving boxes and calving shed and put them in there where they can actually stretch out their hind legs.
Yeah.
I mean, it reduces the amount of leaking, won't it?
Oh, that's a great point, Doreen. Yeah, it is. Yeah, and like great time to do it because most of those calving boxes are cleaned out and disinfected at this stage. So you could whip them in, and you've loads of time. Then the cows are dry. You can sort it out then afterwards. That's a great point. Like, you know, so the facilities are there. There's no pressure on them. It's a couple of bales of straw, and it really mitigates against the risk. And then sure, you've all the next 6-8 weeks of cleaning out and disinfect them then for when the fun starts next February, March, or whenever, or January, February.
People done, do you think, to pull back the nutrition on cows before to prepare them for dry off, to try and pull back the yield in some of these cows?
I definitely, Dennis, and I think there's a fine line between punishing a cow and bringing back the nutrition. You know, they're on 3, 4, 5 kilos of ration now. You take that off a cow and put her on silage oil, you know what milk you'll get. So like you're incorporating straw to increase, to get them nice and tight, bring back the plain nutrition. They'll probably be falling back to cows at the moment. The standard are probably 10, 12 litres, 12, we'll just say 12. So, it's as easy pulling back to 7 or 8 litres then, I think with a lot of the more normal commercial type cows, it's an anatomy issue rather than a volume issue as such, like just the nature of the free milking type of cow we have, isn't it?
I think if you can pull them back a couple of days beforehand rather than the day you dry them,
She's a great job, isn't it?
Yeah, less bagging up. Yeah.
Hey, just a question there, Dennis, I might put to you. It's, it's one that comes up very commonly as well, and it might be a hard one to answer, but, the first milk recording in spring, you have a high cell count cow, and maybe it could have been said at Catherine's as well, finding out what pathogens are maybe important. But what would you do with that high cell count cow? What's your sort of advice on your first recording? And there's a lady that's high, it could be a heifer, or it could be a cow.
Yes, you do your first recording, and she's going to be in one of 2 reports. If she's in the red report, the persistently infected report, it means that she's not cured. So I'd be looking back at her, seeing what her history was like last year. Maybe it was very bad. Maybe it's not possible to cure her at all at that stage. If she's in the orange report, then the recently infected, that means she's a new infection. She's either picked it up over the dry period, most likely, or an early lactation. And she's, as opposed to the other cow, she's very curable, I would say. So I get out my paddle, my CMT, I try and find a quarter. If I find it, there's a great opportunity to do culture and sensitivity, take your sterile sample, like Don was saying, and freeze it for further use. But I think especially those recently infected cows, they're well worth treating and treat them hard at that stage, and get the advice and give them a proper course and treat them, because you have a great chance of curing them. And you're really warranted in treating those cows, because if you treat them and you cure them, obviously hopefully they'll stay cured, and they're reduced. They're not a source of infection for the rest of the cows anymore if you can treat them.
Excellent. Catherine, just in that aspect, we see a lot of heifers calving in with high cell counts. I suppose, what do we do in that scenario, and what might it be telling us as well, maybe a little bit about heifer management?
So I guess all heifers, they are all presumed to be uninfected. So if they're recorded in the first 60 days in milking, there's certainly a threshold. So if more than 15% of our heifer group have an SCC greater than 200 in their first recording, or equally well, if more than 15% needed to be treated for a clinical case, then that deems that, we can call that a specific heifer mastitis problem. Then, of course, it comes back to how those, often heifers are managed as a separate cohort. Maybe they're on slats, maybe they're, brought home on the mouth of calving. It depends on kind of where they've been. I suppose ultimately they've probably got infected somewhere in 6-7 weeks before they calved. And they, of course, it could be at calving as well, but it's about kind of looking back at that housing and management. It's probably important to know that the natural keratin seal that provides some sort of natural immunity towards mastitis across the dry period is actually fairly incompetent in heifers. They have a much poorer keratin seal than adult cows, so they are quite susceptible if they're not, managed correctly. So it comes down to looking at what's the driving factor. Is it stock and rate? Is it the house? Is it they're lying on slats? They're standing on each other's teats? Is it warts that have got out of control? And then, of course, there are options that can be targeted at specific problem herds like teat sealing heifers and so on.
Okay, brilliant, Catherine. So, John, maybe just a question here on should the teats not be disinfected one at a time when sealing each one rather than disinfecting all four and then sealing all, treating all four? Sorry, I'm reading out that wrong. So just go through the routine again, Don, for people on the process itself.
I think that the biggest thing is when you're looking at is mitigating against any infection at the end of the teat after you've done it. And to be fair to the question here, like if you're going to disinfect and finish out the course on that teat, there's nothing wrong with that either. So like you're going to have help. Someone is assisting you. They're handing you the cotton wool. They're handing you a dry coat. They're handing you the sealer, and they're allowing you to maintain contact with the cow, and you can move around as long as you start in the front left, front right, and that's miti. But I suppose for a lot of farmers, what we find is just they're just like it's just a job done, cleaned out, front left. The vast majority, I suppose, of the people that are doing it are cleaning the whole atom the first time. I think where a mistake can be made in some cases is people they clean the teats, they apply the 4 antibiotics, and then they apply the 4 sealers, and they can dirty the base of the back teats. I think I wouldn't be over worried on that. I think if that works for a person, no problem. But I think the crucial thing is that the cleanliness and how clean it is at that, whether you do the whole 4, but you do the antibiotic and the sealer on the back left, but you work clockwise and work backwards anti-clockwise then.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point with that slide with the swab on it. Cleaning and disinfecting are 2 different things. You said it earlier on as well. Just getting that, I guess the SH1T off that teat is so important. Don, I'm going to stick with you just on that, on teats itself. You mentioned about, I suppose, prolapses on teats, and when we go into house cows at this stage of the year, keeping an eye on teat condition. Is there anything we should be doing differently around that, around drying off? Any tips there? You're always good for the practical tips. Just looking at the teats at this time of year. Anything we can do? Like, I'm a bit of a soft lad. My hands get a bit chappy if I do hard work in the winter. The teats are no different when the cows go indoors.
Yeah, a good policy there. I find is the barrier dips after you dip them anyway, which is an emollient, very high in emollients afterwards, which keep them nice and soft. And like, really, what you're talking about, which we do with some operators is, you're trying to, some people will put them back through the parlor again and teat spray them, but you see it's the milk letdown reflex that could stimulate again. But what's very good policy is the disinfectant limes like the sanitary. They're very high. Some of them are used as hand sanitizers as well, and they're very easy on cows' teeth. So the likes of the Stalisons and Prosnex and stuff, I would be using them for the first week, 10 days after drying off cows in that little pack, because number one, the way they're set up, they're very gentle on cows' teeth condition. They really are very, very gentle, as opposed to your hydrated lime and Agrical type products, which can be quite aggressive on teeth. As you said, Tommy, there, the teeth and damage and the prolapse at the end of the teeth, like, time's only going to do that. And you're hoping that's like pulling a hamstring. It's going to be easier to pull it again the next year, but it's just to give it a time, and it's just to minimize that infection. They're very hard to clean, like. Yeah, very hard to clean.
I suppose, Dennis, it was kind of covered there. I'll throw this question at you. Just some tips on housing management. So we focused on hygiene. We're keeping things clean. The cow after we dry her off. Just some tips. We touched on it, but things we need to think about.
After dry off, yeah. So, like, I think both Don and Catherine, they had a slide up with the risk. The high risk is the 2 weeks after dry off, and again, as the cow starts to spring up, the 2 weeks before calving, and there's reasonable safety in the middle. So I think the housing management at those 2 high risk times, you're managing the cubicles, I think, the same as if the cows are milking. Really, that'd be my advice. And the disinfectant lime twice a week or more as well is very useful as well. But manage the cows as if they're milking for the 2 weeks after dry off and the 2 weeks before calving. And you can afford to probably relax a little bit, maybe go once a day for the middle, for the middle period.
Okay, I'm going to stick with you again here, because I think it was a question I had when I was listening to your FarmOps presentation, was how much the data is telling us we're making better decisions with that data, but looking at the cows as well. And the question is, sorry, it's leading in and similar, that teat sealing cows with sealers only that have warts, yes or no, and kind of leads into that maybe we need to keep an eye on these cows, just not the data as well, be it a free milk or any other teat damage. What's the actions on, and anybody can come on this, but maybe I'll ask you first, Dennis, warts on teats, should we be, even if she's below all the thresholds, should we be putting an antibiotic into that type of cow?
I think so. I think you have to be practical as well. I mean, the data is one thing, and data is so important, and using the data, and in fairness to the app, that's all it can do. It can only use what's inside it. But then if you come across a teat or a cow that has warts or has teat and damage or a very free milker, I mean, it's only the herd owner will know that, that's looking at the cow and knows the cow. So I think, like Don was saying, you kind of have to be risk averse with those kind of cows, and they get their antibiotic and they get their teat seal.
Okay, very good. And there's just fantastic questions coming in here, and they're coming fast and thick. I can't even keep up with them. A question here from a vet responsible for deciding next year on farmer whether they need to carry out blanket trichotherapy or not. And this is probably just an opinion, get people's opinion. If there is an issue regarding not enough cubicle space per cow or not enough calving, boxes, pens, is it legitimate to recommend blanket therapy regardless of recording results, sensitivities, etc.? So again, okay, our results are telling us this, but the vet here is probably worried about the potential dangers of the infection pressure, which is the amount of pathogens that these cows might be exposed to. Anyone want to take that question?
Well, I'll start off. I suppose the legislation, to me, really, it's about prescribing, and vets are going to be stuck in the middle here in a difficult position. Farmers are very worried, and vets are very worried because they want to do the best for their clients, but also they want to prescribe as responsibly as they can. And above at the veterinary conference or the cattle conference a few weeks back, that exact question came up. And if there's outdoor cubicles or there's not enough cubicle space, what do you do? And I think what I took from it was that this is a journey, that you don't have to, it's not a sprint, but if you're not suitable this year, if the hygiene isn't good enough, the housing isn't good enough, maybe there's still logic to blanket trichotherapy, but there needs to be movement on that journey. The housing needs to improve. Whatever needs to be done, that journey needs to be happening to actually make progress over the years.
That's a very fair point. That there is, Catherine, if I put that same question to you, that the legislation is changing in January, okay, and we're sort of maybe it's just me, that not 100% clear how that will play out over the next 2 to 3 years. And I think I'm not in a unique position there being unclear. But it is an important transition, and we're focusing on antibiotic reduction, but all these other changes over time will deliver better results on farm performance as well, won't they?
Absolutely, yeah. I guess I certainly can't. I'm with you. There's, we don't know how it's going to be policed, if it's going to be policed, and there has been a somewhat mixed messaging, be my understanding of how exactly the enactment and all of that at prescriber level. However, that being said, in terms of, unfortunately, I can't answer whether that will be allowed or not, but the legislation is very, very, very clear, and that it says antibiotics cannot be used to compensate for poor hygiene or poor husbandry. And the reality is it's there in EU law that says, actually, we can't use an antibiotic because, we don't have enough cubicles for it, and that excuse just won't wash in the long run. Granted, it's going to be difficult. There will be farms that's just the reality. I think the last Teagasc survey said that we were looking at about a third of farms that were overstocked for cubicle heights. So it's sort of a bit of a Brexit negotiation, isn't it? You can't square a circle. But I think I'm certainly with you. I think it's a journey. I think ultimately it'll be about trying to demonstrate that this has to be done, it has to be delivered, and in order to do it, we need to get our house in order, quite literally, get enough cubicles and so on. But also that it is a journey. It may take a couple of years. Some farms will get there quicker than others. But that being said, even if things go wrong in 1 year, that's probably not going to be an excuse to go back to blanket the year after. Those days are gone. So it will be a learning opportunity. I think I also would be careful that there's no fear that, you know, cows that need antibiotic will get it. And, you know, I certainly feel some empathy there for the, you know, it's a sympathy in terms of the prescriber. It's quite a big burden to, you know, make a conscious decision to say, right, well, I'm not going to give you these antibiotics when you know the cows are in less than ideal conditions, or there's just not enough, you know, space and infrastructure is maybe planned to catch up but hasn't got there yet. So it's a very difficult one. How the department will police it, if they will, I genuinely don't know. But I think the legislation has set out the roadmap that just won't be acceptable in the long run. So it will be about trying to encourage and bring people along to try and get us there. And ultimately, as you say, it'll be for the greater good, because farms will benefit if it's done properly and so on.
I think that's a good point. I think what I'm feeling as well tonight, and I picked it up particularly from you, Don. You were very frank, and I suppose you have farmers know you a long time and you're well respected, but you were very honest there. We have a lot of bad habits we need to get better at, don't we? And I mean, you were very straight about that, and I'd agree with you on that. Like, it might be something everyone wants to hear, but that's probably my key message from your thing was those bad habits. Maybe antibiotics have allowed us to be a little bit careless of, you know, around that drying off. You were very strong on that, Don.
Definitely, Tommy. Like, it's just when you hear the numbers that people are doing, and you know, you hear 100 cows done in one day, you know, in God's heart and soul that's, you know, and then like, even I've been lucky enough to be in a few herds that have been doing a bit of drying off, and a lot of the vets know this better than I do. Like, it's, you know, habit is a great thing. They start off great, but they go back into habit, and you see the true colours coming out afterwards, after a bit, you know. And we just have to stand up and hold our hands up. And a great thing with the likes of these reports is you can't go hiding from it. You have a new infection rate that's high. You can't go hiding from it. Something's gone wrong. You know, before that was hidden because we had no way of picking it up, and we were plummossing our own farmers. But no, it's there in front of them. And they have to, because if we don't talk straight to them, they'll destroy their bloody herds. You know what I mean? So the consequences are this crack, like this is here, what's the 70s around blanket Trico? It was revolutionized the whole dairy industry. From and Trico mastitis, I know as a farming from the farm, I don't know when last I saw Trico mastitis. You know, but now, by Christ, we'll see it from now on. You know?
It's a hard thing to give people constructive criticism, Don, but it's the feedback, the breakfast of champions I heard once called. So I think I'm delighted to hear that, that straight talking. Just a little bit, maybe this is back towards you, Dennis, again. You mentioned first lactations maybe been deemed vulnerable and getting a longer dry period. Just explain that to people, and you know, you see it on farm, it makes a lot of sense, but would you take that question on, just, you know, the first lactations and maybe some of the figures there around decision making that's in FarmOps?
Yeah, I suppose that's just the title we put on that category, vulnerable cows. But okay, I suppose the idea of drying off the first lactations early, that there's plenty of evidence there to show that if they don't get a long enough dry period and enough chance to recover, I suppose, their udder and recover physically from the first lactation, that it actually can impact the performance in their second lactation and the rest of their milking career. So I think it makes perfect sense to dry them off early, give them that extra 3-4 weeks dry to give them enough time to recover and then really hit their straps for the second lactation. What they're going to be producing anyway is probably going to be very little efforts for the last month.
Okay, Dennis, excellent. I'm conscious of time here, and there's lots of questions, and I know that probably the Munster Bovine team will come back to answer these questions, and I'm conscious of the panelist time. Doreen, I know you like a good football analogy there, and you like bringing in Kevin McMillan and broke our hearts and Kerry at the end. Just, I suppose, that question there that one of the vets asked around prescribing, it is a challenge there around, you know, where facilities are. Can you give your opinion on that question we talked about?
I think, Tommy, where we look at it is we're on a journey, you know, and we are where we are, right? And as Don says there, I mean, for the last 10 or 20 years, the dry cow and the antibiotic, I mean, it really has eliminated dry cow mastitis, and it has allowed us start off the season by and large, I mean, with quite low cell count. So basically what we have to do now is each herd has to look at itself. Where are they on the journey? And they have to start tackling the cell count and the mastitis. And if a herd owner hasn't got enough to do with this, you know what I mean, and hasn't got enough carbon box space, you know what I mean, he just has to go with blanket. But he cannot keep going each year with blanket, he has to address, you know what I mean, the actual issues that's there. Because there is no point in reducing the amount of antibiotics used in the dry cow period and then next spring having massive increased use of antibiotics in the dry cow and milking period to overcome, you know what I mean, the increased cases of mastitis that are actually gotten at that stage. I mean, and I think from herd owners, what they basically have to get to is, we are on a journey now. We have to tackle SCC. We have to tackle mastitis. We have to go milk recording. We have to provide, you know what I mean, the cubicle space per cow. You know what I mean? And we need to actually get on that journey. And we need to stop using antibiotics for preventative. And you know what I mean, it's as plain as the more antibiotics we use, you know what I mean, the more AMR that's actually there. And I think, as Don says, we're only 12 weeks away from the 26th of January. And the big thing each herd owner needs to do now is set themselves up for 2022. You know what I mean? Where are they with the facilities? Where are they last year with how they got on? You know what I mean? Across the dry period with the new infections in cows, the new infections in heifers, right? And it's the most important job we do for the next 2 months, to get a good dry period into those cows. And if we don't do it, we'll actually pay the consequences, you know what I mean, in 2022. And no one wants to do that, especially with the compact calving we actually have now. And the other thing, then, Tommy, is for herd owners that are stopping using selective, talk to their vet, use as much data as they possibly can. So I mean, see what their facilities are, and try it in 10% of the cows if they are suitable in the first year. But as Don and Catherine says, do not underestimate the risk of going seal or only in cows. Because there's 220 herds on here tonight. And if I was a cow, how many of those herds would I like to be overwintering in? You know what I mean? So we have to ask ourselves that question. And the big thing is do not underestimate the risk of just putting up the actual sealer alone. Because putting up the antibiotic with it, it has allowed us to get away with an awful lot.
Yeah, change is the only constant in life, and we've a difficult road ahead of us. But a journey has been used by all our panelists, and I think it is. But we have the expertise, we have the willingness, we have the ability to do all those things, and lean on every advisor, vet, person you have available to you to give you advice that will help you make better decisions, because those decisions will impact the performance and profitability of your farm. We're producing milk, we're producing human health foods on farm. I say it all the time. And I think we can do it. So we shouldn't be fearful of it. We can tackle it. I'm going to go, I'm conscious of time. I'm absolutely delighted with the discussion. I unfortunately haven't got to all the questions. We could be here till 11 o'clock. I won't do that to the panelists this evening, but I will ask them maybe to one or two key messages they'd like farmers to get from this evening as they look into dry off 2021 and beyond, whatever beyond will look like for all of us. Just one or two key messages to finish up from each of the panelists, please. So Dennis, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I suppose one group of cows that wasn't mentioned tonight is the cows that have no chance of curing. You know, so those cows that are high SCC all year, that they had a long dry period maybe last year and didn't cure. They were high last year as well. And every herd, I think, has a few of these, and a lot of herds, or there's some herds that have quite a few of them, and they're a real source of infection. And if they didn't cure last dry period, they have no hope of curing this dry period. And there's actually a poor use of antibiotics as well, trying to cure cows that haven't the hope of being cured. So I think, you know, we have to take a long, hard look, and now is probably the time to look at them, some of them cows that, you know, they shouldn't be around for the next lactation. So get advice on those cows, I would say, because they're a real source of infection. Next year, they'll be still the same. Great tip. Catherine, going to you next for your one or two tips.
I guess I'd be honest and be careful about where I am in terms of that journey now, and you know, what do we actually really need to tackle to improve milk quality, because that's the overriding principle of Selective Trico. Good mastitis control means that we will be safe in reducing our antimicrobial usage. And also I would say, you know, we're all aware it's going to be very difficult, and start slow and build confidence. But equally well, remember that this is it might be regulation, but it's certainly for the right reasons. And, you know, it's a no-brainer in terms of why we need to do it. So keep the positivity.
Excellent message. Don, going over to you, 1 or 2 tips.
Yeah, I suppose, look, it's all about the planning and the hygiene. And look, we said there's a significant risk, but there's a significant benefit for the farmer as well. And it can be done. It's nothing to be fearful. It's something to be respect and to just take it. Like, we've the herds like the O'Sullivans and this stuff there that are, what, 85% on selective only and doing it consistently. And there's a lot of herds like that, but it's just use the data that's there. Like Tommy said there, you use the expertise, but plan it and hygiene. I think the hygiene thing, like one man's clean is another man's dirt. You know, you just gotta, it's really self-critical analysis, like is, I don't know, you just really have a significant chat in that, like.
You know, the honesty of that is refreshing. It is that hygiene piece to me is absolutely key if you're going into. Just think about it again, and however clean you are, go cleaner again. So I think that's very, very important messages. I think you made an important point as well, Don. There's a lot of farms actually doing selective trichotherapy. Someone has said even in the questions there, they've been doing it for the last 3 years. So there's a lot of people doing this. It can be done. Doreen, I'm going to go to you. You gave a good summary, but maybe final points for the night. The last couple of words, maybe summing up what was a very good discussion. And I'd like to really thank all the panelists again for their contribution. And it's been excellent. Doreen, last words to you.
So for Tommy, I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's a journey we have to get onto again, in the sense to reduce the antibiotics. We no longer have the protection of putting in the antibiotic with the sealer. So the fact we haven't got that protection, we have to be so careful putting in that sealer. And each herd owner has to look at what do they have to do to tackle the SCC and the actual mastitis control in their farm. Because the key is lower SCC, lower mastitis numbers, use less antibiotics. And by doing that, there is an opportunity there now to do a really good dry off and to treat those cows that are high. And as Dina says, do not be wasting antibiotics and causing more AMR in cows that are not going to actually cure. I mean, so identify those immediately. And then if the herd is suitable, try selective trichotherapy on a small percentage this year. I mean, and see how it goes. And the key is a good dry off will set you up for 2022. I mean, that is the key. And it's the most important job we do for the next 2 months. And if we don't get it right, we will be paying the consequences next spring. So I mean, we don't have time to do it.
Okay, excellent. Okay, focus, hygiene, stay positive. There's a lot of pressure on farming at the moment. It seems to be coming at all angles, but I think tonight was about practical solutions, good advice. There's a lot of great work being done on farm. And to all the farmers who tune in this evening, thank you very much for your time. Thanks again to the panelists, and to everybody. Keep up the great work, and hopefully here's a very successful dry off 2021. And good night, everybody, and thank you very much.